Share my screen. All right. So hello, I'm Ethan. I'm one of your front-end TAs. And today I'll be going through lecture 3 about advanced CSS with you. So we're going beyond what you guys learned in the previous lecture, a little more advanced topics for making your websites look better. And then Rebecca will be here today in a little bit to take over the second half. But yeah, other than that, I'll get started. The first topic is positioning. So positioning is how elements are placed on the screen relative to other elements around it, relative to the elements that contain it, and also relative to the entire screen as a whole. So we've linked just this website here. They've got a lot of documentation about web development. They've got a lot of documentation that you can scroll through on your own time. I'll just show you this like first page. So you can do that however you like. But I'll go through the 5 main types of positions that you'll see for elements that you can specify in CSS. First off is static. So this is your default positioning. If you don't specify any other type of position, it will already be implicitly be static. And what that means is that elements will follow the quote unquote normal flow of a web page. Kind of what that means you can see here. First is that the block boxes will flow vertically downward, starting at the top of their containing block. So if the entire containing block you can think of as an entire browser window, it'll start at the top and make its way downward, and usually takes the full width of your screen. And then the inline elements will reside in some block level container. Maybe it's the entire thing, maybe it's some smaller block that you've defined, and appear side by side, usually horizontally in what we refer to as the normal flow of elements. And then if they're long enough that they reach the rightmost wall or edge of the container, then by default, they'll just wrap around to the next line within the container, again, staying horizontally. So 0, 0, you can think of as a starting point at the top left. It's not the bottom left like you would in like a math class or a graph. Top left, and then positive directions mean more to the right and more to the bottom. Next up, we have the fixed position. As you can see in this little animation, an element's position will not change, even if you scroll around, even if you resize the window, even if other stuff on the screen moves around, it will always stay in that position relative to the entire viewport, as it's called, or the entire viewing screen in your browser. Next is relative. This is pretty similar to static in that it's a position relative to the default static position. And for example, if we were to set the property top to 20 pixels for some element that has position relative, then that means the element will be offset by 20 pixels away from the top of that default static position. So note here that even though the property name is called top, you're not actually moving upward by specifying a certain number of pixels. You're actually moving down from it, away from that top reference. And so for the 4 other directions, it's the same. If you specify left, that means you're actually moving your element more to the right. Yeah, and then again, it's pretty similar to the default static position. So if you had, top, left, right, bottom, anything with 0 pixels, you're basically offsetting your element by a relative 0 pixels, and it'll stay right where it is as if nothing happened. Okay, and then the last 2 you should know are absolute and sticky. Absolute is a little easier to think about. These elements are positioned relative to the nearest positioned ancestor. And real quick, what a positioned ancestor means is that it's the closest ancestor, so either the parent or the parent's parent, or however many parents up, the first one that has a set position value. So something other than static, because again, the static value is the default one. And a use case might be for adding a background to your website. So say you had this kind of gradient background as an image, and you wanted to place this image as an element to go kind of behind all of your other elements. We have, our title, we have these 4 cards. They all take up space and they all take, they have, area on the screen. And usually if we had not specified absolute positioning for this gradient background, and we put it, say, after this cloud tech card, probably it'll end up starting down here in this lower region because it comes after all these other elements. But by setting it to be absolute, it actually moves outside of the normal flow of elements in your browser and does not take any space. That's why this whole big gradient element can exist in the same areas that other elements also reside in, because it has an absolute setting, so it takes no extra space. It does not like clash with other elements. And finally, sticky. This one's not used as much, but it kind of looks cool if you do decide to use it. It essentially toggles between a relative and fixed positioning. So I think the easiest way is just to look at how these little rectangles move here. So as we're scrolling down, a new element will scroll into our field of view. And once it hits the top, it'll kind of just stick there. And that's when it'll behave as if we're fixed to the top until another sticky one comes up and kind of pushes out of the way. And until then, it's just the relative layout. All right, any questions about any of that before I show a little demo on it? Okay, if not, let me stop sharing and get a different screen up. All right, here we go. So I just have some HTML code here, CSS code here, and a preview window just simulating what you'd see in your browser over on the right side. So down here, we got our normal HTML setup with the head, and looking into the body, I've commented everything out except this first part. I'll draw your focus to here. We have one div, we call it a box container class. That's what you can kind of see in this white outline. And then 3 smaller boxes inside of it, box 1, 2, 3. And over here in the CSS, here's the area about positioning. As a reminder, here are short descriptions of the the main positioning attributes you're going to use. Static is the default one. You don't really need to specify it. It's going to be there by default. Relative means you can offset an element relative to where it usually would be in a static default position. Fixed is relative to the entire browser window. And absolute means you specify a location for it in the entire window yourself, not relative to any of the other elements. So right now, box 1, 2, 3 are the selectors for these boxes. And right now they're just giving us colors. And again, they're all static by default. So let's take a look at, let's say, what relative will look like. So let me uncomment this. This is the line to specify its type of position. Position is a property, and you can just type in relative as its value. Let's save that one and this one, and let's see what happened. May do maybe just one of these at a time, comment that out. All right, so it's positioned with type relative, value relative, with left 50 pixels. And you see it shifts away from this left edge where it was originally at by default by 50 pixels. So if I had gone 100 pixels, then I would just go even further out to the right. So again, whatever you type here, if you assuming you put in a positive number, then you would be moving that many pixels in the opposite direction. And again, you can combine multiple directions. So left and top can both have values. And now it's shifted 15 pixels down and away from its top edge of where it would have been by default. So that's how relative works. How about let's look at fixed. I'll uncomment these 2 lines. Again, position this time is fixed. And I'll save it. And let's see what happens. The box shot all the way over here to the right edge. And that's because I specified right to be 0 pixels. And again, What that means is the right side of the entire window, since again, the entire window is what is the reference frame for a fixed position. And we should be 0 pixels away from it. So it kind of just sticks there. And it doesn't leave it, no matter what happens in the rest of what we think of as the normal flow of elements. And we'll also take a look at absolute. Of those, position absolute, maybe let's not do that. Let's do like just 100 for now. Refresh it. And okay, it looks a little weird. Let me do 250 so you can see a little better what happened. Uncomment it again just so you can get a reference to what it normally looks like. Here it is, box 1. Below is box 2, offset a little bit, and below it is box 3, and it's kind of to the right. Then see what happens again once I put back those lines, position absolute, top 250 pixels, and I refresh it. Suddenly all 3 boxes have changed their position, even though we only really changed the properties of box 1, meaning it is now 250 pixels away from the top of the entire viewport, or in my case, this panel over here. But in doing so, we've taken box 1 outside of the normal flow of elements, and it's not as if it's not even there. It's not even taking up any space. That's why box 2 and box 3 have shifted up, because they think they're like, the first 2 boxes that are defined in the structure, even though technically box 1 was defined above it. So keep that in mind if you try to use an absolute positioning where you didn't have one before, and suddenly all your other boxes suddenly moved also. It might have been because of this. And I think I can show you sticky too. I think that's why I had like 1,000 before. So if we had absolute 1,000, then we get like a scroll bar, which is what I wanted to show you. Box 1's way down there. Let's comment that part out. And now box 2, oops. Box 2 will become sticky. And let's save it. So now it's kind of back to its normal position. It's not offset or anything. But once I do start scrolling, it'll be fixed 20 pixels away from the top. So that's why I grab the bar, slowly dragging it, slowly dragging it. It's still not at the top yet. But once it does hit the top, or at least 20 pixels away from the top, that's why it'll stick there. Okay, that's all I have for the demo on this part. Let me head back to the slides. Oh, and then some questions. How can you turn on the, okay, let me go back to the VS Code then real quick. Sorry, I didn't see the chat earlier. How can you turn on the preview panel? That's through an extension. I think it's over here called HTML preview. It's like has like a strike through because it says it's no longer being maintained, but like it still works for its purposes. You download this one, you go to your index.html or HTML file, right click it, and then open preview, and it'll open another one. And then all you need to do is make sure you're at your index.html. If you make a change, make sure to save it, and then it'll refresh automatically here. Another question, part of the question was, sorry. Static and relative doesn't seem very different. Yeah, so relative is almost the same as static, except you get the added feature that, let me show you again, one comment here, comment that out. Instead of being in its truly default position, you can just offset it in any direction you like by however many pixels you like. So that's the key part here. You can add offsets to that. Yeah. How is the default position specified? You won't need to specify it. If you don't set position to be anything else, it'll already be the default, which is the same as static. But if you do left and right, which one takes precedence? Default is just, yeah. So I think you mean, I think the question is asking if here I had like right 100 pixels, what happened? Let's take a look. In this case, it looks like left, like still applied to the box. And if I comment it out, I guess it goes to the right. Let's go back to that. And yeah, could I explain absolute again? Sure. So absolute positioning just means it's still relative to something. It's just not relative to any of the other elements on the screen. It's almost as if we're saying, pretend they don't exist. We're just gonna, well, whereas box one, we're just gonna say box one is, somewhere on the screen relative to the very top 0, 0. So right now it's 1,000 pixels below 0, 0. So if I set this back to like 170, refreshed it, this top left corner is just going to be, what was it? 170 pixels below the origin of the screen. Question, is the relative one mean it is relative to the rev page? No, relative means all the same properties as the default. So wherever it appears normally, plus some offset in the horizontal and vertical directions. If that makes sense. Okay, cool. Yeah. So if no more questions on this one, let me go back to the slides real quick. On to our second main topic for today, which is display properties. So the two main ones you'll encounter are inline versus block. Inline elements or elements that have the inline property. These ones have no exact height and width that we can specify, and they're arranged one after the other. I don't know what is a comma, but they're arranged one after the other, usually side by side. And if they reach the edge of the container block or the edge of the screen, then they'll wrap around. And that contrasts with the block type elements because these generally start on a new line. So for example, if we had some span and set the display property to type block, that means in here, this word is within the span, which is within the p tag. And instead of having this next word, here's going to be block styled in one line, like you would normally imagine for some text. It knows that span is a type, is a display type block, as we specified here. And that makes it jump into kind of a line of its own. And so the stuff before it can't exist on the same line, so it goes above. The stuff after it here also can't exist on the same line, so it's going to end up just below it here. And by default, some inline elements are span, a, image. Some default block elements are div, the h's, paragraph, list elements, things like that. And here's just a visual about block versus inline. So if you had a bunch of block elements, they're all going to stand on their own lines, kind of stacked vertically like this. Versus inline, they'll stay side by side horizontally until they reach the end of the screen, and they'll wrap around again. And here I've included, just do Google search, a good article that I thought about inline versus block. There's also one more called inline block. You could think of that as a middle ground between them. Let's see what they say. It displays an element in an inline level block container. So the ordering kind of follows the same fashion, side by side, horizontal wraparound, but you can set the height and width values just like that. So they can become, whatever uneven size that you like. And yeah. I think that was it for block and inline. Later on in the demo, you're going to see that again real quick. But the next big topic is, there's a question. How is span an inline element if it puts its contents on a new line? I think span might be an inline element, but you can kind of override that default property by explicitly putting the display colon block if you want a block element, and then that'll force it to become follow the block style. But yeah, I think if we didn't do that, that line was not there, it would just normally be one line horizontally. Yeah, great question. But yeah, moving on. Grids versus flexboxes. So these are two ways of positioning a bunch of elements within a container. The first part is the grid. You can place elements into a 2D matrix, specifying columns, rows. Here's a row, a column. Here's one individual cell, and then you could also have like a rectangular area that is composed of multiple cells and allows elements to either occupy singular cells or span a greater area, or maybe span an entire row or column. And then the alternative to that is a flexbox, which is used a lot, and it's very popular for developers. As the name implies, it's flexible with responsive layout structure without positioning. So what that means is it's content aware. So the contents of a Flexbox container will kind of determine the size of it. So if you have more text in something, it'll be a bigger size. If more items, it'll be a bigger size versus if there are fewer items. Unlike a grid, it's specified one-dimensionally along either the rows or the columns you have to choose. And it'll change item widths without any notion of specifying, oh, I want the first two columns or the last two columns. You can just change widths kind of almost continuously in between. For working with these, you want to avoid specifying any width attributes for the actual Flexbox container, because that just defeats the purpose of the whole dynamic nature. It can be whatever width the content inside it specifies. So Flexboxes have a bunch of default, or sorry, not default, but a bunch of built-in properties, a ton of them actually. Here are two of the most popular or most commonly used ones. FlexGrow specifies how items within the Flexbox container share the available space. So should it be equally shared? Should some take more space than others? That's up to you, and you specify that with FlexGrow. FlexWrap means you wrap the items to the next line if there are too many items present in the container. Let me open this link. Flexbox Froggy is a kind of a nice little website for a tutorial of how Flexbox works. There's 24 levels. Well, I already completed it, so it's already filled in. But pretend this was not there at first. You're basically trying to get your Froggy over to the lily pad without actually changing any HTML. You can only change the CSS that in the lines they provide. So they'll tell you about a property, what are the possible preset values it can take. So justify content, for example, tells the whole container how should the items within it be positioned, and flex n sends it to the end. So after you do that, you hit next, yay, and then you get to continue on again. Pretend that wasn't there, and it's kind of like a little game. 24 levels, try to get all the frogs onto the lily pads. But I don't want to show too much of that. I think you can go there by yourself. It's a kind of fun exercise. And as for whether you want to use Flexbox versus Grid, again, the main distinction is that Grid has a 2D layout, a multi-dimensional layout, whereas Flexbox has one-dimensional. So if you had, say, mocked up some design, this is your template, like you had a header, article, some text, some other size text boxes, and you ask yourself, oh, how do I want to make this? Do I use a grid? Do I use a Flexbox? It's really up to you, however you envision it. I guess maybe if you think that the exact size, the exact positioning of where everything's going to be, like this article is going to take 50% of the width, this is going to take 50% of the width, this header will take 100% of the width, and so on. You can use a grid and define it exactly how you want. If not, you can use multiple flex boxes. Again, oh, I guess this image has a typo, flea box. But again, since flex boxes, you can only specify layout in either one row or one column. You're going to have to nest a bunch of flex boxes inside of each other to get this multi-dimensional layout. But at the end of the day, it's up to you what you want to use. They both have their uses. One question, if we have Flexbox, why do we care about positioning elements manually? It's because all layouts can be done on Flexbox. Yeah, so Flexbox definitely is like an abstraction and an encapsulation of all the kind of positioning capabilities that I've been showing you in a nice way. And you can definitely use Flexboxes like as much as you like. It's a really great way to do that. But in terms of, positioning, like I've showed you here, it's still good to just know the underlying fundamentals of how everything is placed. So if, you run into some bug and your button's not appearing where you want it to be, you can kind of break it down into these fundamental parts if you don't think you can debug it through a Flexbox. Because I'm pretty sure Flexbox is just under the hood, will style everything based on these initial properties. A performance issue, no, I don't think there's anything to do with performance issues or anything like that. Yeah, in terms of like HTML and CSS, at least, performance issues, runtime, I don't think are like huge concerns to think about. So go ahead and use Flexbox all you want. Yeah, and then if no other questions so far, I'll go into a quick demo of these features before our halfway mark. So let's get my VS Code back up. Okay, here we are again in the CSS file. Let's just comment this out and we'll bring in a grid example. So here's a grid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then a huge 7. And let's see how that works. So first off, there's a grid container. Inside of that, we have 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're all class grid item. And the 7th one is also class grid item, but I've also added a second class grid item big, and you'll see what that corresponds to over here. So here's a grid container. We need to specify display grid so that it knows that this container should act like a grid. The width can be anything you like. Here's the main one that you should look out for, grid template columns. You can actually specify more than one value here. And the idea is for each value you specify, that's going to represent one column of your entire grid structure. So right now, auto just assigns 3 columns of equivalent spacing. That's why 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all have equal widths compared to each other. But if you don't want to do that and you want to have uneven spacing, I think you can specify percentages for each column to determine how much width that should take up. And same for grid template rows. You can also specify that to have greater control over the size or the number of rows that you end up getting. And then looking into the actual items of the grid, some color, border, padding, font size, text align, and you can see here there's nothing really to do with the grid itself, which is kind of nice. If you just have an item that you want to appear in a grid and it's not something crazy, then you throw it into a grid container that already has the template for you, then it'll know how to distribute them appropriately. But there's also number 7, it's bigger than the others. And the way I did that is with these 2 properties, grid column start and end. So in this grid, you can think of it as having 3 columns, but that also means there are 4, I guess 4 like lines separating them. I guess I call it that. The first one at the very left side, the second one, the third one, and then the 4th one at the very right edge. And so grid column start specifies the item corresponding to this class, which is number 7, will start from the specified line 1 all the way at the left edge and go until line 4, so all the way to the right edge. And that's why it takes up all the width. So I think if I change that to 1 and saved it, then only lines 1, 2, and then stops at 3. If I had done maybe 2, 2, 4, we can specify it to start from line 2 and end at 4. So that gives you a little more control over how to place a specific item. All right, any questions about how a grid works? There's a lot more stuff that goes on inside of a grid, but I'll just be going over these basic fundamentals for now. Okay, if not, let me get that back out. I think I forgot to show you this part. Let me do that real quick. So just like in the example, we had a p tag with some text, and then plop inside of it is a span tag. Right here, we've selected the span tag to be color red, and currently display is set to inline. You don't really need that. It'll be inline by default, but just so you can see it there. And that's why it's all one line, like normal. Comment that one out and instead put display block. Let's refresh it. And just like the slide you saw before, it thinks that this span should be a block type element, and block elements will instead move down and vertically into its own kind of row. And that's how you can manipulate the ordering of some elements. All right, and then last part of my demo will be Flexboxes. That starts here. And let me grab these two. Got the first one first. So if you had some sort of nav bar, a bunch of nav items inside of it, this is how you might style it. For your nav bar class, the container, you want to set display equal to flex. And like I was showing you on that Flexbox Froggy website, you can set justify content on the container to dictate how its items should be placed. One example is space between, meaning these spaces will be evenly and equally distributed across like all the items, so it just takes up the entire width of your container. If I had done space around, that's pretty similar. Oh, okay, well, you could barely see it because it's so small. But the difference here is that not only are the spaces in between, but also the spaces on the outside suddenly become equally distributed. So, and again, just set some arbitrary width and color and padding. And again, the nav items, I didn't really need to do anything if I didn't want to. They could just have their normal properties. I didn't really have to set anything specific to Flexboxes. These items don't even know that they're inside of a Flexbox. That's the job of the navbar container. One question, how would you make the Flexbox vertical? Yeah, it's a good question. Let me, well, I guess I'll show it later, but you could do that by setting one of the properties to be the flex direction to be column instead of row. I think row is just default, so even though you don't see it here, it just does that by default, and then specifying a column will make it go vertically. But I'll show you that back on the Flexbox Froggy website in a bit. Yeah, good question though. Yeah, so let me get this last little section uncommented. And this shows you what I was talking about flex grow. So Flexbox class for the container, and then items for those items inside of it. Same thing here, not too much to look at. The main part is that I've added flex grow 1 to the item class. So all three of them are actually item class, except I've also added item big as an ID to number 3. And I've actually changed flex grow to be 2. So now what happened is these numbers are kind of like unitless proportions for how much space they should take up within the whole container. So 1 and 2 both have value of 1. Their flex grow value is 1, but number 3 has 2. So that means a 3 will take up twice as much space as 2 does. That's why 1 plus 1 plus 2 is 4, and then 1 and 2 take a quarter of the entire width, and 3 takes up 2/4 or a half of the entire width. And so if you want more items or some items to be bigger than others, this is one quick and common way you can do that. And yeah, that's all I had for this demo. Any questions about how Flexboxes or grids or any of that worked? When structuring a website, should we have a root Flexbox which contains multiple Flexbox and children? Or is it better to separate them all? Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely very common to have like a big Flexbox as a container representing your entire screen. Like if you wanted to control all the elements inside of it, then you can definitely do that. Or if it makes sense, whatever your use case is, to have them separate and just have them be one after the other, that definitely works too. Yeah, let me real quick go back to Flexbox Froggy and try to find where they start going vertical. Right here. So flex directions, what it's called. You could do row reverse, column, and column reverse. So that's why instead of being green, then yellow, then red, like we saw in all the other ones, they're now vertical. So hopefully that could apply to do that. All right, so that was it for my half. I think Rebecca's here to take on the second half. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And then another question, is a Flexbox commonly used as a kind of scaffold? Yeah, basically. So the Flexbox, you commonly think of the box being the container and whatever items or elements go inside of it. It could be more containers, it could be images, it could be just singular items. Those are whatever items you want. And the Flexbox is kind of like the overseer that tells them where to go relative to each other. Yeah, good questions. Yeah, and if that's it, then why don't I hand it off to Rebecca?
Great. Yeah, so hi, I'm Rebecca, and I'll be doing the second half of the lecture. So to begin with, does anyone know what the CSS stand for? If you know the answer, you can just type it in the chat. Yeah, right. Thanks, Jonah and Chi. Yeah, it's a cascading style sheet. So, so the cascade, by the definition, is a process whereby something is passed on. So if you say cascading style sheets, that means that the style sheets are layered top on one another. And this is pretty important concept for the next topic, which is cascade and specificity. So one important thing to note about parent and the cascade is that classes inherit parent class properties. And so we can create hierarchies of styling by leveraging cascading to differentiate child properties from that of their parent. And what I mean by that is, let's look at this diagram in the next slide. So there is one parent class and one child class, right? And if you look at the code on the right, we see that we have set the color to be red in the parent class, but we have set nothing in our child class. But if you look at the comment here, this child class, even though we haven't assigned color explicitly, this will inherit the parent class property, which is color red. So if we render this on our website, the child element will also have the color red. Yeah, so, and just to note, the parent class is kind of like a container element of the child element, but I will explain more about that in the demo. So let's quickly move on to demo. Does anyone have questions so far? If not, I'll just move on to the demo. So this is the code, the skeleton code. And let me switch the tab. Yeah. So the skeleton code is quite simple, right? So we have head text, which contains information about this HTML file. And these are the body. And this is like the body tag. And these are all the elements that are rendered on our website. So we see there is one heading, which is Advanced CSS demo. And then inside one class, which is called a box container, inside this box container, there are box 1, 2, and 3. So there are 3 boxes inside our box container. Now, if you look at our CSS, for now we have nothing, but the first change, let's say the first change we want to make to this website is making all this text to be colored red. And one way to do this is by using this asterisk as a selector. So if you use asterisk, this means we are selecting all the elements in the HTML file. If I save this and refresh the page, now you see that all the text has become red. To have the same effect, what I can do instead of asterisk is by using this body tag. And the reason for this, if we go back to our HTML file, we see that the body tag is the parent of all other elements in the HTML file. So if you just set the body tag to be color red, all the other elements will inherit this color red from this body tag because body is the parent of all other elements. So if I save this and refresh this again, nothing changes. And for now, let's say we only want to change the heading color. Well, to do that, I will uncomment this. So if I set H1 to have the color black, and if I also increase the font size to be 70 pixel, what this code snippet will do is override this body tag. Because inside the HTML file, we see that H1 is like a more specific tag than the body. So this H1, H1 CSS property will override the parent property and set the H1 color to be black and increase the font size. So if I save this and refresh the page, we now see that the heading has changed its style. But this doesn't apply to, of course, any of the box text because we haven't really override any properties. We didn't set any style to these box text. Let's move on to the next example. The next example is p tag. So what this will do will change the color and the font size of these box text. Because if you go back to our HTML file, we see that box 1, 2, and 3 are all included in this p tag. So if I set the color and the font size for the p tag, this will be applied to this box 1, 2, and 3. I save this and refresh the page. We see that the font size have increased and the color has changed to blue. Again, the p tag has override this color red that is set by the body because p tag is more specific than the body tag. Does anyone have questions so far? If not, I will move on to the next example. Now, there is another way to change all these box text, like box 1, 2, and 3, all at once, and that is by setting the style for the box container. And the reason for this is we see on box 1, 2, and 3 all uses p tags, but we also see they have one same parent class, which is box container. So if we change the style of the box container, the properties of the box container will be inherited to these boxes. So for the box container, I set the display to be block. I set the padding to be 30 pixel. I set text align to be center, and etc. If I save this and refresh the page, we see that the styling has been applied to the boxes. But one thing to notice here is that inside the box container, we set the color to be white, right? So it should have made sense to just like this text color also to become white. But the reason why it remains blue is because of this P tag. So both P and box container tries to change the text color of these boxes, but because the P tag is more specific than the box container, the P tag color, which is blue, will override the white text color that is set by the box container. Yeah, and the last example for this part would be setting the style for each of these boxes. So for example, to start with, if I uncomment this, yeah, so this code will only be applied to box 1, right? And if I save this and refresh, we see, like as expected, the background color becomes red and the text becomes black. And the same thing goes for box 2 and box 3. So this code will change the background color of box 2 and box 3. And wait, yeah, there is one last example for this part. So I will uncomment these 2 divs. So this div is, so there are basically 2 divisions I'm trying to add. Both of the division have 1, 2, 3 as their contents, but for the second div, I just named the class to be div2. If I save this and refresh, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 appears as expected. The reason why its text color is blue is because I'm using the P tag. And remember that the P tag has the color blue. Now, let's say I only want to change the font size and the color of div2, which is this second 1 to 3. My attempt would be try to access this div2 class, because basically like this div2 class is the parent of all of these 1 to 3 content or the numbers. I will try to use this class selector div2 and then change the color and the font size. But if I save this and refresh, nothing changes. It does not increase the font size, nor it does not change the color to be red. The reason for this is because, again, the P is like more specific selector for this 1 to 3. P is more specific selector for this 1 to 3 than div2. So even though the div2 is trying to set 1 to 3 color to be red, it is overwritten by these P tags, which set 1 to 3 text to be blue. Yeah, so I guess that's it for the demo. Does anyone have any question for the cascading and like specificity? Is it good practice to use classes inside P and not by itself because of this overriding problem? What's the difference between classes and tags? So to answer the first question, in practice, I would recommend assigning the class name as much as possible and try avoiding using the P tag or H1 tag or like any other HTML element tag, because they are general and they will be used oftentimes. So you, for example, if let's say for this H1 tag, I have set the color to be black, but I forgot this, and inside this HTML file, I used H1 tag multiple times later on. And then like, even though I don't want that H1 to be black, it will become black because you have set this H1 to be black, H1 to be black. So it's a better practice to assign class names and then, like use the class selector when you style the elements because it's more specific. Yeah, and to answer Jonah's question, what's the difference between classes and tags? So the class, so class is this assigned name. I think this is covered in the last lecture. So the tag is this like general HTML tags like body, H1, div, P, right? Those are called tags. But the classes, you can name or group certain tags by assigning class name. So like class box 1, class box 2, class box 3, these are the classes. So this P tag, or just like a tag in general, this will be applied to every PHTML element. So like this would be this P tag, this P selector will be applied to this, like all of these box 1, 2, and 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. But because the class name is only assigned to this specific P tag, if I set box 1 to be background color to have like green, this background color will be only applied to this box 1. Does that make sense? Great. And to answer the last question, IDs and classes, they are similar. I think that depends on your use, but IDs are more specific than the classes. So I will give you an example. So let's say I have ID box 1 ID here. Because ID is more specific than the class, right now the box 1 has the background color red, as you can see here, right? But let's say I want to override this. So, and if you're using ID, you select it by using this character. I don't know what's this called in English, but you use this character to select the IDs and box 1 ID. And I want to override the background color to be, let's say, green. If I save this and refresh, because ID is more specific than the class, it will assign the color that is, assigned by this ID instead of the class. For the CSS, is the class name more specific than the tag? Yeah, that's correct. And in the last lecture says we use class rather than ID attribute. I would say if you want to assign a certain style to a group of elements, you use class. But if you are only assigning that style to one unique element, then I would recommend using the ID. And can you show the code for box container in CSS again? I think it is this one. Yeah. And yeah. Oh, I see. Ethan has answered the question. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, that's it for the cascading part. I think I can move on to the slide. So yeah, in summary, this is the general rule for specificity. Again, this asterisk is used when you are selecting all the elements in the HTML file. The next general thing is a tag. And again, the tags are like this HTML tag, like h1, body, div. Those things are the next general thing. Then comes the classes, then comes the IDs. For now, I think you guys can ignore style tag because it's not used that common in practice. How does the height of the box container is specified? You mean inside this website? Let's see. Height. I guess. The browser doesn't show any errors even if you use the same ID. Yeah, I think for the height, the Ethan's answer is right. Although I'm not too sure, I'll try to get back to that after the lecture if I have time, because I don't want to just give my personal thoughts on that. If you can like leave a question in the ad, I can answer that later. And for the browser doesn't show any errors even if you assign the same ID for multiple elements. Yeah, so it wouldn't give error, but I would say that kind of like goes against like the use for the IDs. And yeah, you can use the same ID for the multiple elements. Just note that that's more specific than the class. So if you kind of like assign a style to that ID, it will override all the class properties that was assigned previously. Yeah, so I'll move on to the next part. The next part is pretty brief. It's the animation and media queries. So this is like an example. Yeah, this is like the example of the animation that can be made by only using the CSS. So it's like built-in CSS animation. So if you hover over the button, the text will change and there is some more animation to that. This is another example of the animation that is made by using only the CSS. So the CSS can increase the size, shrink the size of the element. It can also like move around, rotate the element. Yeah. And there are like tons of animations out there. And I believe the CSS can make almost every animations possible. So it's kind of like not possible for me to go through all of the animations that we can do using the CSS. So the best way, so if you want certain animations to be on your website, the best way is to Google it and like, so let's say you want to make your box bigger, then you can just Google how to make my HTML element bigger by using CSS. Yeah, that's like the general approach when you apply the animation to the HTML elements using CSS. But for the demo, for the sake of demo, I have one example of the animation that you guys can follow easily. So let's go back to our skeleton code here. One of the most common animation is by using this hover selector. So what this means is apply these properties when this cursor or pointer is hovering over this box 3. And the first animation that I want to add, or like the transition that I want to add, is changing the opacity. Yeah. So if I write this code, what this means is that if I hover over this box 3, I want to make this box 3 more transparent or makes the color more lighter. So if I refresh the page and hover over this box 3, we see that the color becomes lighter. Now, the next animation that I want to add is making this box bigger when I hover over it. And I can achieve that by using this transform property. And this scale 1.3 means I want to increase the size of this box tree by 30%. And on the contrast, if you say 1.7, that will shrink the size of the box by 30%. But anyway, yeah, so I will do 1.3, save it. And if I refresh the page, now if I hover over it, the color still becomes lighter, but like the size also becomes bigger. But like if you hover over it, it just kind of like instantly changes its size. So what you probably want to do is add this transition duration. So what this means is that I want this transform to take 1 second. So instead of increasing the size instantly, I want to gradually increase the size, and I want that to take 1 second. If I save this and refresh the page, now if I hover over it, it will gradually increase its size instead of, like instantly changing its size. Yeah, I think that's it for my part. I guess I can end the lecture early, but before you guys drop off the announcements, the homework one, the homework for HTML is due September 21st. I guess it's next week. Oh, it's today. Yeah, it's due today. And the homework two, it's due September 26th. Yeah, so that's it for today's lecture. Thank you for coming. Do we have social decal this week? Ethan, do you know?
I don't think it's like a social, but each Friday that same time, 2 to 5, is blocked out as like a homework party kind of time. Unless we specify that like we're having some other event. It's usually just going to be homework party, kind of open office hours kind of thing.
Could you go over style specialty again? You mean like what's more specific, like specificity? Okay, yeah, for sure. Thanks for asking. You mean this part? Yeah, so when we're styling using the CSS, we have this like tag or like the selector, right? And for the selector, we can either use asterisk, HTML tag, classes, or IDs. So if we use asterisk, or I'll just use this one, this is like the most general thing because it will change, it will be applied to every element inside this HTML. Then comes the tag. The reason why the tag is the next most general selector is because if I just say P and like don't specify any class name or ID name, it will apply to every P tags in the index.html. So like regardless of whether it has class or ID, it will just apply, it will be applied to all of these P tags like box 1, box 2, box 3, and these numbers 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Then comes the class. So if I, for example, if I say dot box container, yeah, this is like the next general selector, I should say. And then comes the ID selector, which is using like this character. Does that make sense? Like, do you have any other things that you're confused about? What about the style tag? For the style tag, I believe this is like an HTML tag, right? So this is not a CSS, but rather it's directly changing the style inside the HTML. So for example, I don't remember exactly, but yeah, there's like a style tag here. And if I set like 3 and then hmm, yeah, sorry. I'm not, we don't really use this like style tag often. I might have to look again for its use to like make sure. So like I can get back to you with this. But in general, it's a good idea to just keep your styling in the CSS and not use like style tag inside the HTML.
Oh yeah, and then to add on to that, I think
Mhm.
in addition to the style tag, if you had a style attribute, like you had div class equals div2, style equals,
Oh,
and
I
then in
see.
strings, you could specify your own style. Then it
Mhm.
also counts as having that same like highest specificity. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think general coding practice is to not put, this is like inline CSS where you're trying to just throwing everything right where it is. But like for this HTML CSS kind of setup, it's generally recommended you shift everything to your .css file. Now, and the question for classes .id hashtag. Yeah, you got it
Mhm.
right. You're welcome. All right, did you guys have any other questions for us? All right, cool.
I think we can end the meeting.
Okay, yeah, let me stop the recording then.